I want you to close your eyes for a second and just picture a scene with me. It is the absolute dead of winter. We're talking early February. And in this specific part of Central Asia, that doesn't just mean it's chilly.
No, not at all. This is cold that's on another level.
It means the air actually hurts to breathe. It means the ground is frozen into a solid block of iron. It is just bone-chillingly, fundamentally cold. And in this freezing gray landscape, thousands of young men are pouring into the streets.
It creates such a stark, powerful image right from the start.
It really does. They're streaming in from 3 different directions, all converging on this single square right in front of a big, imposing government building.
The contrast is just...
It's immediate.
You have this lifeless, frozen environment, and then this massive surge of human energy moving through it.
Yes. But here's the detail that really sticks with me. The thing that makes this whole scene so unsettling. These men, thousands of them, described as the Jijits, which means the brave youth, they are completely unarmed. The text we're looking at today says they didn't even have a piece of broken iron in their hands. Nothing. No weapons, no shields, not even sticks. Just their bodies, their breath misting in that freezing air, and they're walking straight toward a force that is described as being armed to the teeth.
And that visual, that exact image of the vulnerability of the unarmed crowd versus the mechanized metallic power of the state, that is really the central anchor of the source material we're analyzing today. It sets the stakes for absolutely everything that follows.
Exactly. Today, we're doing a deep dive into what is known as the February 5th Ghulja Revolution, or, well, to be more specific, we're analyzing a primary source document. It's a transcript of a commemoration speech that tells the story of that day back in 1997.
And I think it's important we're clear right at the top about what we're doing here.
Yes, absolutely. We really need to set the stage regarding the nature of this source.
Right. We aren't reading a sterile history textbook today. This isn't a government report or, some kind of UN file. We are analyzing a transcript titled Commemorating the February 5th Ghulja Revolution.
Which means?
It means this is an internal, community-based account. It is passionate, it is raw, it is incredibly emotional, and it is told entirely from the perspective of the Uyghur resistance.
So we're essentially seeing history through their eyes today. We're not here to verify every single claim. We're not here to take a political side. Our mission is to unpack their narrative.
Precisely.
We want to understand how they see their own history, what their specific grievances are, and the internal logic that led thousands of those young men to walk into that square in 1997.
Exactly. And honestly, the text is so fascinating because the path to that revolution is not at all what you would expect. You might think, okay, it's a story about, political parties or underground manifestos.
Right, secret meetings, pamphlets.
But this story involves moral discipline, traditional community gatherings called mashrap, and I know this sounds completely improbable football.
That is exactly what hooked me when I first read through this. I mean, we're talking about a major political uprising, a revolution as they call it, and the road to that uprising is paved with bodybuilding, soccer leagues, and religious chanting. It's this wild mix of things that just don't usually seem to go together.
It is a surprising combination, I'll grant you that.
Yeah.
But when you start to peel back the layers of what was happening in that society, it actually makes perfect sociological sense.
So help us understand this. How on earth do we get from a soccer match to a lethal standoff with the army?
Well, to understand the explosion on February 5th, 1997, the source argues that you have to understand the pressure cooker that was built over the previous 40 years. You really can't just look at the spark, you have to look at the fuse.
It's a long fuse.
The long fuse. And the speaker in this transcript, they lay out a timeline that is, frankly, it's harrowing. They describe this long fuse as being lit way back in the 1950s.
Okay, so let's unpack that timeline. Because the source doesn't start with the 90s, which is where the protest happens. It goes all the way back to 1950. What's their argument about this era?
The core argument the source makes is about one word: erasure. The speaker refers to the region simply as this land, or our homeland, and they assert that from the moment the Chinese state took control, the single goal was assimilation.
But not just assimilation in the sense of, learn our language, join our culture. It sounds like they're talking about something much more aggressive.
Oh, much more. They're describing a systematic elimination of the Uyghur identity. The source uses some very strong language here. It talks about washing the brains of the youth.
So what does that actually look like in practice, according to the story? How do you wash the brain of an entire generation?
Well, it starts with what you could call a societal decapitation. Not necessarily a literal one at first, but targeting the leadership. The source details a strategy that they say began right in 1950, which involved the systematic removal of all the societal pillars.
The pillars?
Yeah, the text lists them out very explicitly. Intellectuals, religious scholars, the wealthy, business owners, and anyone described as people of intelligence.
People of intelligence. That feels incredibly broad. I mean, who does that even leave? It sounds like they're arguing that the state was trying to induce a kind of societal brain damage.
That's a brutal way to put it, but it aligns perfectly with the source's argument. If you look at the sociology of resistance, or just, community health in general, who organizes a society?
The leaders, the thinkers.
It's the people who have the capital to fund things, the religious authority to bless things, or the intellectual capacity to articulate ideas. The source is arguing that from 1950 onwards, the strategy was to remove the head. If you remove the thinkers and the leaders, the body, the general population, is just left flailing.
That leaves them completely rudderless.
Exactly. If you remove the guides, the people get lost. The source then argues that once those leaders were gone, the state introduced a false history. They claim the state destroyed historical monuments to physically sever the connection between the people and their own past.
It's like they're saying, if you don't know where you came from, you can't possibly know who you are.
That is the precise sentiment. The argument is, if a young Uyghur man in, say, 1970 looks around, he shouldn't see anything that reminds him of his grandfather's world. He should only see the state. That's the goal they're describing.
And this was also tied to an economic strategy, right?
Yes. The source argues this cultural erasure was coupled with a very deliberate economic strategy. They claim the priority was, number one, to keep the population poor, and number two, to keep them ignorant.
Poverty and ignorance.
Right. And in this narrative, poverty isn't just an unfortunate byproduct of a bad economy. It's a tool. It's a weapon.
How?
Well, if you are struggling every single day just to put food on the table, you don't have the time or the energy to organize a revolution. You don't have time to sit around and study your history or your religion. Your entire focus is on survival.
You're too busy to resist.
You're too busy to even think about it. And it's in this section of the source that a detail comes up that really stopped me in my tracks. We hear about poverty and political purges and a lot of historical conflicts. It's tragic, but it's a familiar pattern.
Right.
But then the source mentions atomic tests.
Yes. That is a jarring detail that just completely shifts the tone of the document. The source explicitly mentions nuclear testing conducted in the region prior to 1980.
It's a massive part of the grievance narrative here. We know historically that atmospheric nuclear testing happened in the region. But the source frames this not as military testing or scientific progress. They frame it as poisoning the well.
Literally poisoning them. They say it resulted in strange diseases.
Right. The speaker claims these tests cause distinct physical and character impacts on the population. They describe various strange and different diseases appearing among the people. Cancers, birth defects, things they claim they had never seen before.
It adds this whole other biological dimension to the grievance.
It really does. It adds a layer of visceral horror to the text. It's one thing to say, you won't let us pray, or you're rewriting our history books. It's a completely different thing to say, your bombs are mutating our children.
It changes the stakes completely.
It has to. I mean, if you believe the state is physically poisoning your environment, then coexistence isn't just difficult, it starts to look suicidal. It implies that the state doesn't just want to rule you. They don't fundamentally care if you physically survive.
And that theme, that idea of a direct physical threat, it just ramps up even more when they get to the 1980s. This is where the source starts talking about birth control.
And I have to say, the rhetoric here is just incredibly intense.
It is. This is where you see the demographic anxiety just come roaring to the forefront. The source discusses the birth control policies implemented after 1980. But they don't describe it as family planning or, public health policy. They frame it as an existential slaughter.
Yeah, the text talks about killing millions of babies. It uses this absolutely horrific image of throwing them into trash bins. It's visceral. It's designed to make your stomach turn.
And it does.
It's meant to. The speaker is arguing that these policies were specifically designed to lower the birth rate, to shrink the Uyghur population toward extinction. So if you combine the killing of the elites in the 50s, the poisoning of the land with nuclear tests, and then the restriction of life through birth control in the 80s, you start to see the picture they're painting.
It's a picture of total encirclement. Like every single aspect of their existence, their past, their present, and their future is under a coordinated attack.
Exactly. The source frames these policies as a threat to the survival of the people as a biological entity. And that right there sets the stage for the 1990s. If the 50s were about killing the leadership and the 80s were about stopping the next generation from even being born, the 90s, according to the source, were about destroying the youth who were already there.
Okay, so this brings us to what the outline calls the crisis of the 90s. The source describes a real shift in tactics here. It seems like the target moves squarely onto the backs of young men.
Correct. The source describes a landscape of just absolute despair. They talk about mass unemployment leaving young people completely jobless and hopeless. But the primary accusation here, the real core of the 90s crisis, is about poison.
Drugs.
Drugs. The source explicitly claims that the state opened the road for poisonous habits. They list alcohol, tobacco, and, most devastatingly, heroin.
Okay, let's hold on for a second. I want to play devil's advocate here for a moment. Please. Drug epidemics happen everywhere. We've seen it in the U.S. Rust Belt. We've seen it in parts of Europe. When an economy collapses and people lose their sense of purpose, addiction often follows. It's a natural, albeit tragic, consequence of poverty and despair.
That's true.
So, does the source offer any proof that this was a state plan? Or is this just a community looking for someone to blame for a terrible tragedy?
That is the critical question. And this is where you have to understand the specific environment of that region. We're talking about one of the most heavily policed, most surveilled regions on the entire planet.
So the argument is that nothing moves without a permit. Nothing happens without the state knowing.
Precisely. The argument the source makes is based on capacity. They're essentially saying, look, you, the state, have the power to stop a single political pamphlet from crossing the border. You have the power to stop a religious book. You have checkpoints everywhere. So how is it possible that truckloads of heroin are moving freely into our neighborhoods?
I see. So the scale of the incompetence is the conspiracy. The failure to stop it is evidence of complicity.
In their view, yes. If the state is that powerful, and it is, then the presence of the drugs on that scale must be permitted. The source uses that specific phrase, opened the road. They argue that the state viewed the youth, specifically young men, as a latent threat, a sleeping giant.
And how do you keep a giant asleep?
You sedate him.
That is a terrifying calculus.
That's Machiavellian. The source claims the state viewed the youth as the strength of the nation. And to neutralize that strength, they intentionally facilitated the flow of heroin and alcohol. The text describes thousands and thousands of helpless youth perishing due to addiction and what they call moral decay.
So you have a generation that is unemployed, feeling erased by history, and now, according to this account, being systemically drowned in heroin. It sounds like a complete and total societal collapse.
It was a crisis of existence. And usually when a society faces a crisis this deep, where the government is viewed as the enemy and the social fabric is tearing apart, you see a counter-movement emerge. You see a survival mechanism kick in.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the survival mechanism they describe wasn't a political party. It wasn't a guerrilla army. It was mass rap.
Mass rap.
So for those of us who aren't familiar with Central Asian culture, let's define mass rap properly. It's not just a party, right? That feels like the wrong word.
No, party is definitely the wrong word.
Okay.
The source defines it beautifully as a school of the people. Traditionally, mass rap is a gathering. It's a cultural institution among Angers. Think of it as a cross between a town hall, a court of law, and maybe a variety show.
A court of law? That's surprising.
Yes. It involves music and poetry and food, sure, but it also involves moral instruction and community accountability. If someone in the community has been acting out or violating social norms, they might be called out, critiqued, even gently shamed during the mass rap. It's where community norms are enforced and culture is transmitted from one generation to the next.
It sounds like a mechanism for social hygiene, for, keeping the community healthy from the inside.
That's a great way to put it. And in the context of this massive drug crisis in the 90s, the source says that religious figures, intellectuals, and what they call people of mind revived this tradition specifically as a kind of rehab program.
To save the kids from the heroin.
Exactly. The goal was to use their own culture to pull them out of the despair. The source says the objective was to help the youth recognize themselves, to reconnect them with their religion, their responsibilities, and their identity.
But they didn't just sit around reading poetry and talking. This is where my favorite part of the source comes in. And honestly, it's the part that I think makes this story so unique and so human.
The football connection.
The football connection. They realize that if you want to get a huge number of young men off the streets and away from drugs, you have to give them something to do. And what do young men love?
Football. It's such a pragmatic, brilliant detail, isn't it?
It's amazing. The source explicitly mentions that because the people loved football, the organizers of these mash raps combined the moral gatherings with sports.
Come for the soccer, stay for the moral awakening.
That's basically it. And it wasn't just football, right? The source also mentions physical training and bodybuilding. They were emphasizing physical fitness, strength.
Right. They weren't just trying to save their souls, they were trying to save their bodies, to rebuild them after the damage of addiction.
So just imagine the scene. You have these neighborhoods just decimated by addiction. The traditional structures are gone. And suddenly you have these guys getting clean, getting ripped, playing soccer every day, and reconnecting with their faith and their community. It's like a Rocky montage, but for a whole society.
It really is. But let's pause and look at the sociological implication of that Rocky montage. When you put a bunch of young men on a football team, what are you actually doing? Structurally.
You're organizing them. You're giving them a structure.
You're organizing them. Exactly. You are teaching them teamwork. You are giving them a uniform. You are giving them a schedule to follow. You are instilling physical discipline.
It strikes me that they were essentially building a shadow army, even if they didn't call it that. I mean, a football team is basically a platoon. You have a commander, the coach, you have drills. You have shared goals. You build camaraderie.
And that is exactly why the state, according to this source, panicked. The source says the transformation was instantaneous. The text says youth flocked to these gatherings in huge numbers. They abandoned heroin. They stopped drinking alcohol. They left their wicked ways.
They got their lives back.
They did. They became, in the words of the speaker, moral, faithful, and patriotic.
You'd think any government on earth would be thrilled about this. Hey, look, the drug epidemic is solved. The crime rate is plummeting. The kids are healthy and have a sense of purpose.
You would think so if the government's primary goal was public health and social stability. But remember the narrative this source is building. They argue the state's goal was never stability. It was to weaken the population.
Right.
So when this cure appeared, this grassroots mash rap movement, it wasn't viewed as a social good. It was viewed as a threat.
Because they were organizing. It always comes back to that.
It always comes back to organizing outside of state control. The source argues the state could not tolerate this awakening. The youth were becoming disciplined, they were becoming united, and most dangerously of all, they were answering to a moral authority that wasn't the government.
They were listening to their mashraq leaders, their coaches, their imams, not the party secretary.
Precisely. And so the hammer comes down. Hard. Very hard. The source details the crackdown that followed. The mash rap gatherings were suddenly declared illegal activities. Large groups of youth who were, just days before, being praised for getting clean were now being arrested for participating in these moral gatherings.
And they went after the sports, too. This part of the text is so visual, and honestly, it seems so petty. The source details the physical destruction of the football infrastructure itself.
Yes. It's an incredible detail.
They didn't just close the fields. The source says they plowed them up, they dug them up with water, they literally tore the fields apart.
It's a scorched earth tactic applied to leisure. It's a shocking image.
But why do that? Why physically destroy a patch of dirt? What's the point?
The point is to kill the gathering space. A football field is more than just a place to play a game. It's a public square. It's a place where people congregate, where they talk, where they bond. If you plow it up, you disperse the crowd, you atomize them again, you force them back into isolation.
It feels so symbolic. Just imagine being one of those kids. You finally got off drugs, you're playing on this team, you feel good about yourself for the first time in years, and then you show up one morning and the field has been destroyed by a bulldozer.
It sends a very clear, very brutal message. You are not allowed to gather. You are not allowed to be strong. You are not allowed to heal yourselves. The expert insight here is that the state recognized that the football field had become a political space.
Even if it was just about sports.
Even if it was just about sports. It was a space of autonomy. And in a system of total control, autonomous spaces cannot be allowed to exist. So it had to be destroyed.
And padlocks. I remember the source mentions they put big padlocks on the gates of the fields that they didn't destroy.
Right. So this brings us right to the breaking point. You have a population that feels historically erased. They feel biologically threatened by state policies. They tried to fix their own social problems through mash rap and sports, and the state came in and crushed even that.
So the pressure is just building and building. The steam has nowhere to go.
Exactly. The source describes the mindset of the people at this exact moment. They started asking themselves a question, and the text quotes it. Should we just let them arrest us and finish this off without doing anything?
It's a back against the wall moment. There's nowhere left to retreat.
It is. And the source mentions a crucial realization that happened around this time regarding the religious leadership. They talk about the red mullahs.
Red mullahs. I'm assuming that means religious leaders who were working with or co-opted by the Communist Party.
Yes, exactly. The source claims these co-opted leaders had been misleading the people for years, telling them to be obedient, to stay calm, to not cause trouble. But at this moment of crisis, the people, specifically the youth, rejected that leadership.
They stopped listening.
They stopped listening, and they came to a new theological conclusion on their own. Obeying the invader was haram. It was religiously forbidden.
Wow. That is a huge shift. It's not just we don't like you anymore. It's God forbids us from listening to you.
It completely changes the conflict. It transforms it from a political dispute into a religious obligation. It elevates the struggle to a sacred duty. And that realization, that theological break, leads us directly to February 5th, 1997.
The flashpoint.
The decision was made. The source says they decided to make a public declaration. To, in their words, separate our obedience to Allah from you.
So take us back to that day. We're back to that cold winter morning we started with.
It is February 5th. The source calls the men who gathered Ghuljas. And as we said, this is a culturally loaded term. It means brave young men, cavaliers, guys with honor and courage. They gathered from the various mashrabs. So this wasn't a random mob. It was an organized procession of these community groups that had formed around football and faith.
And they marched from 3 different sides of the city, all converging on one spot.
Yes, converging on the square in front of the Ghulja city government building. The force makes a point of emphasizing the extreme cold again here, -degrees. Absolutely freezing. But they marched anyway.
And let's talk again about what they were holding. Or, maybe more importantly, what they were not holding.
As we mentioned, the source is emphatic about this. They were unarmed, not a single piece of broken iron. But they were carrying banners. The source says the banners were written with the Kalima Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith.
There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger.
Exactly, the most fundamental statement of their faith. And they were shouting slogans. The source quotes them directly, and they are incredibly blunt. Hey, invaders, get out! This land is our land. You have no rights here.
There is zero ambiguity in that message.
None whatsoever. And then the most significant one, the one that really crosses the line. We do not recognize your laws.
That is a moment of revolution, isn't it? When you stand in front of the government building and say, your laws, your authority, they don't apply to me anymore.
It is a total withdrawal of consent. They were publicly and collectively breaking the social contract. The source describes it as a declaration of independence of the soul, if not yet the territory. They were saying, our obedience is no longer yours. It belongs to God alone.
And they were doing this completely unarmed, while facing down a massive military force.
A tooth-and-nail armed aggressor, as the text puts it. That contrast is absolutely central to the source's argument of moral superiority. We had faith, you had guns, we had truth, you had force.
And sadly, we know what happens when unarmed men march against armed forces. The source is very, very blunt about the outcome.
It is. The text says the movement was suppressed with blood.
It describes a massacre.
Yes. It says many were shot and killed on the spot. The source says others were arrested, thrown into trucks, and later executed or imprisoned indefinitely. In military terms, it was a crushing defeat. The uprising was put down almost immediately.
And here's where the text gets really profound, I think. The source doesn't sound like a story of defeat. When you read the transcript, it doesn't read like a eulogy for a failure.
No, it really doesn't.
They talk about it as a victory. How is that possible?
This is the power of reframing. And the expert analysis here is crucial. How do you take a massacre of your people and turn it into a victory? The source argues that the victory wasn't military. It couldn't be. The victory was moral.
So what were the achievements according to the text? How did they win?
Well, first, they proved the people were not asleep. Remember that earlier narrative about brainwashing and trying to make them ignorant? This event proved that the brainwashing had failed. The people were awake and aware.
Right, they showed up. They proved they were still there, still conscious.
Second, they publicly identified the state as the enemy. It sounds simple, but in a totalitarian system where speech is controlled, just pointing at the state and saying you are the enemy is a radical, powerful act. And by doing this, the source argues that they whitened the face of the nation.
Whiten the face. That's an idiom for saving honor, right? Cleansing shame.
Yes, exactly. It means they restored the nation's honor. The source argues that if they had remained silent while their football fields were destroyed and their friends were being arrested, it would have been a shame on human history. By standing up and dying, they saved the nation's honor for future generations.
It's the classic idea that it's better to die on your feet than live on your knees.
Precisely. And the source goes even further, taking this into the realm of theology. They reframe the death of these young men not as a tragedy, but as a religious triumph.
This is the section on martyrdom.
Yes. The source uses the term shaheeds, martyrs, and it quotes the Quran directly. It says, "Do not say those who are killed in the way of Allah are dead, nay, they are alive."
So in the narrative of the source, these guys aren't gone. They're in a better place. They are enjoying the blessings of paradise.
Correct. And this creates a very stark, very powerful binary choice for the listener, for anyone in that community. The source lays it out clearly. The struggle against this enemy is a religious obligation, what they call a fard.
So there is no middle ground. You can't just keep your head down and try to survive.
Not according to this text. The source explicitly states that helping, obeying, or cooperating in any way with the enemy is a major sin. It is haram, forbidden. So the equation they present is simple. Resistance equals paradise and honor. Obedience equals hell and humiliation.
That is an incredibly powerful mechanism for mobilization. If you truly believe that, then you really have nothing to lose by resisting.
And that is the legacy the speech is trying to cement. It concludes with a powerful call to action. It says the struggle must never stop. It tells the current generation, the people listening to this recording, that they have a sacred duty.
A duty to live in a way that allows them to face the martyrs and Allah without any shame.
Exactly. It's a burden of memory. The speaker is essentially saying, these men died for you. Do not let their sacrifice be in vain. Their story is now your responsibility.
You know, stepping back and looking at this whole arc, it's obviously tragic, but it's also incredibly cohesive. You can absolutely see the logic they're presenting.
The internal logic is flawless from their perspective. You start with the grievance, this feeling of total erasure and being poisoned. You try a peaceful, constructive solution, the mash wrap in football. The state destroys your peaceful solution. So you are left with only one option. Absolute public resistance.
It really makes you think about the unintended consequences of oppression. By crushing the football leagues and the cultural gatherings, the state didn't make the people more obedient. They actually removed the only safety valve that society had left.
That's the so what of this whole deep dive, I think. The source argues that the state essentially created its own worst enemy. By criminalizing the mash rap movement, which was actually solving social problems like drug addiction, they forced the youth into a corner where the only remaining path to honor was martyrdom.
It's a classic tragedy. The cure was criminalized, so the disease of conflict was guaranteed to explode.
And the specific details the source uses, the freezing cold, the no broken iron, the plowed-up soccer fields, these aren't just historical facts in the source. They are emotional hooks. They are details designed to be remembered, to be told and retold, to ensure that this story is never forgotten.
Which brings us back to the source itself. This video transcript, this commemoration speech, it is, in its own way, an act of resistance.
It is. It is an act of counter-memory. The state may control the physical territory, and it may control the history books that are taught in the schools. But as long as this recording exists, as long as people are sharing this story of the football revolution, the erasure they were fighting against is not complete.
It's preserving the specific texture of the past, not just we revolted, but we revolted because you locked our soccer fields.
And we revolted on a day when it was so cold it hurt to breathe. Those details matter. They make the history real and human.
So after all this, what does this all mean for us, or for anyone listening? What's the takeaway?
I think it really challenges us to look at the concepts of obedience and rebellion in a new light. The source suggests that for this community, at that moment in time, obedience was the tool of their destruction.
How so?
They believed that if they continued to obey, they would simply be quietly erased, poisoned by drugs, reduced by birth control, forgotten by history. Obedience meant slow, silent annihilation.
And so rebellion, even a fatal rebellion, was the only path to life, or at least to honor.
Exactly. It challenges you, the listener, to think. What happens when a community feels that their very existence relies on refusing to follow the law? When law and order feels like a death sentence, chaos and revolution can start to look a lot like survival.
That is a very heavy thought to leave on. It's not just about history, it's about the human breaking point.
It is. It's about what happens when you push people too far.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. From the purges of the 1950s, all the way to the drug crisis of the 90s, the rise of the mash rap athletes, the destruction of the fields, and finally, that freezing cold morning on February 5th.
It's a story of resilience, ultimately. Whatever your politics, the sheer human will to assert an identity in the face of what feels like total erasure is just undeniable in this text.
Absolutely. Thank you for walking us through this, for unpacking all the layers of this really fascinating and difficult document.
My pleasure. It's a piece of history that definitely deserves a deeper look.
And thanks to you for listening to this deep dive. We hope this gave you a new perspective on a piece of history you might not have known much about. Until next time, keep asking questions.